Before we begin this remarkable journey through history, please take a moment to support our channel. If you find this documentary valuable, hit the like button, subscribe to stay updated with more historical content, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Now let's begin. The morning of September 8th, 1943, dawned with an unusual stillness over the ancient town of Assisi, perched on the slopes of Mount Subasio in the heart of Umbria. The stone walls that had witnessed centuries of pilgrims seeking the spirit of St. Francis now trembled under a different kind of presence, one that brought not peace but terror to the narrow medieval streets. The announcement had come through crackling radios and hushed whispers passing from doorway to doorway. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allied forces, effectively ending its alliance with Germany. For the ordinary citizens of Assisi, this news brought a momentary flutter of hope, a brief illusion that perhaps the nightmare of the previous years might finally be drawing to a close. Yet for those who understood the strategic mind of the German command, this armistice represented not an ending, but a beginning of something far more sinister. Within days of the armistice announcement, German troops poured across the invisible lines that had previously defined zones of Italian sovereignty. The occupation was swift, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient, transforming the Italian peninsula into what military strategists would later call the Gothic Line, a defensive position that would hold Allied forces at bay for months to come. In cities across northern and central Italy, the German presence manifested not merely as a military occupation, but as the implementation of policies that had already devastated Jewish communities across Europe. The final solution, that horrific euphemism for systematic extermination, was now to be extended to Italian soil, with the same ruthless efficiency that had already consumed millions of lives in Poland, Germany, France, and beyond. The Jews of Italy, who had lived in relative safety under Mussolini's fascist regime, despite its anti-Semitic laws, now faced the prospect of deportation to camps whose very names would become synonymous with humanity's darkest chapter. In Rome, the Jewish community of 12,000 souls lived in a state of mounting anxiety. The ghetto, one of the oldest in Europe, had been a center of Jewish life for centuries, its residents contributing richly to the cultural and economic fabric of the Eternal City. When the German occupation began, many Roman Jews initially believed that their long history in the city might somehow protect them, that surely the Nazis would not dare to implement their most extreme policies in the shadow of the Vatican itself. This hope was shattered on October 16, 1943, when SS units swept through the Roman ghetto in a coordinated raid that would become known as Black Saturday. In a single day, over 1,000 Jews were rounded up, packed into trucks, and transported to a military college where they were held before being loaded onto trains bound for Auschwitz. Of those deported that terrible October day, only 16 would survive to see the liberation of Europe. The shockwaves from the Roman raid rippled outward across Italy, reaching into every town and village where Jewish families had made their homes. In Assisi, the Jewish community was small, consisting primarily of families who had sought refuge from larger cities, hoping that the town's religious significance and relative obscurity might offer some measure of protection. Among these refugees was the Viterbi family, who had fled from the coastal regions as German control tightened. Professor Emilio Viterbi, his wife Grazia, and their children arrived in Assisi with little more than what they could carry, their lives reduced to the contents of a few hastily packed suitcases. They were not alone in their flight. Throughout the autumn of 1943, Assisi saw a steady influx of refugees, both Jewish and non-Jewish, seeking shelter in a town that seemed to exist in a kind of spiritual sanctuary. The Bishop of Assisi, Monsignor Giuseppe Placido Niccolini, was a man whose gentle demeanor belied a core of absolute conviction. Born in 1885, he had spent his entire adult life in service to the church, rising through the ranks not through political maneuvering, but through genuine pastoral care and theological scholarship. When he received word from Rome, specifically from Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, who would later become Pope Paul VI, the message was clear, though carefully worded. The Church must do what it could to protect those being persecuted. This instruction, passed through careful channels to avoid direct implication of the Vatican in activities that might provoke German retaliation, gave Bishop Niccolini the authorization he needed to act. Yet even without such authorization, those who knew the bishop understood that his conscience would have compelled him to action regardless of official sanction. In a series of quiet meetings held in the bishop's residence, a plan began to take shape. Bishop Niccolini called together a small group of trusted individuals, each chosen for their particular skills and unwavering commitment to human dignity. Father Aldo Brunacci, the bishop's young secretary and a canon at the Cathedral of San Rufino, was appointed to chair what would become known as the Committee of Assistance. Brunacci was a scholar, a man more comfortable with ancient Latin texts than with the mechanics of conspiracy, yet he possessed organizational abilities that would prove crucial in the months ahead. Father Rufino Nicacci, the guardian of the Franciscan monastery of San Damiano, brought a different set of qualities to the enterprise. Born in 1911 in the nearby town of Deruta, Nicacci was robust, practical, and possessed of a creative mind that could devise solutions to seemingly impossible problems. It was Nicacci who would become the operational heart of the rescue network, the man who would coordinate the complex logistics of hiding and protecting hundreds of refugees. Luigi Brizzi, a local printer, represented the civilian element of the network. His print shop, located in the town center, would become a clandestine factory for the production of false documents, the identity papers that could mean the difference between life and deportation. Brizzi worked alongside his son, Trento, the two of them laboring late into the night to produce documents of such quality that they could pass even careful German inspection. The forged papers typically identified their bearers as residents of Lecce, a town in southern Italy that had already been liberated by Allied forces. This clever stratagem meant that any German attempt to verify the documents would be thwarted by the impossibility of checking records in territory they no longer controlled. The monasteries and convents of Assisi numbered in the dozens, a legacy of the town's centuries-long history as a center of religious life. Many of these institutions operated under strict rules of enclosure, their walls designed to separate consecrated religious from the outside world. Under normal circumstances, the admission of outsiders, particularly women and children, into male monasteries or men into female convents would have been unthinkable, a violation of monastic rule that could result in ecclesiastical penalties. Yet these were not normal circumstances, and Bishop Niccolini possessed the authority to grant dispensations from these rules. One by one, the heads of Assisi's religious houses were approached, the situation explained to them with careful clarity. Jewish refugees needed shelter, and the monasteries and convents offered hiding places where German soldiers were unlikely to search. The response from the religious communities was not uniform. Some superiors agreed immediately, while others required time to wrestle with the implications and dangers. The risk was substantial and explicit. If the Germans discovered that a religious house was harboring Jews, not only would the refugees be deported, but the entire community of monks or nuns could face arrest and potentially execution. Despite these dangers, the majority of Assisi's religious institutions agreed to participate in the rescue network. The convent of the Clarisses, the German Capuchin nuns, the Stigmatine and Collegio orders, and the Benedictine nuns of Sant'Apollinare all opened their doors to Jewish refugees. In some cases, entire families were accommodated together. In others, husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, as the network sought to distribute refugees across multiple locations to avoid concentrating too many people in any single hiding place. Father Nicacci established his operational headquarters at the monastery of San Damiano, the very church where St. Francis had heard the voice of God, calling him to rebuild the church. From this historic location, Nicacci coordinated the complex dance of hiding and protecting refugees, whose numbers grew week by week. Each new arrival presented a unique challenge. Where could they be hidden? Could they speak Italian well enough to avoid detection? Did they have any particularly Jewish features or mannerisms that might betray them if seen by German soldiers or fascist informers? The Viterbi family, given false papers identifying them as the Vitelli family from Lecce, were permitted to live relatively openly, though they understood that any interaction with German authorities could prove fatal. Grazia Viterbi, now Graziella Vitelli, according to her forged documents, spent hours in the Assisi library, studying everything she could about Lecce, memorizing street names and local customs, so that if questioned, she could answer with the confidence of someone describing her actual hometown. As autumn deepened into winter, the network expanded beyond Assisi proper. Father Michel Tode of the Sacro Convento became another key figure in the operation, his connections to other Franciscan houses across the region, allowing the network to extend its reach. Refugees who arrived in Assisi, but for whom no suitable hiding place could be found in the town itself, were guided along carefully planned routes to other locations, each step of the journey fraught with danger. The escorts who accompanied these refugees were often members of the clergy themselves, their clerical garb providing a degree of protection as they moved through checkpoints and past German patrols. The Germans, despite their suspicions about Catholic assistance to Jews, generally hesitated to detain priests and nuns without solid evidence of wrongdoing, knowing that such actions could provoke broader resistance from the Italian population. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was harsh, the cold settling into the stone buildings of Assisi with a penetrating chill that made the already difficult conditions of hiding even more challenging. Food rationing affected everyone in occupied Italy, but for those in hiding, obtaining adequate nutrition became a daily struggle. The nuns of the various convents performed miracles of resourcefulness, stretching meager rations to feed not only their own communities, but also their hidden charges. In September of 1943, as Yom Kippur approached, the nuns of one convent prepared a special meal to break the fast for their Jewish guests, a gesture of solidarity that transcended religious boundaries and brought tears to those who witnessed it. For the Jewish refugees, this act of respect for their traditions, carried out by Catholic sisters who had devoted their lives to Christ, embodied a profound truth that human decency and divine love recognized no sectarian boundaries. The network's success depended not only on the courage of its organizers, but also on the complicity, or at least the silence, of the broader Assisi population. The townspeople, going about their daily business, certainly noticed the presence of strangers, the refugees whose faces were unfamiliar, and whose nervousness was sometimes evident. Yet remarkably, there were no betrayals, no informants who reported the hidden Jews to the German authorities. Whether this silence stemmed from genuine solidarity with the persecuted, from loyalty to the beloved Bishop Niccolini, or from the town's deep identification with the peaceful legacy of St. Francis, the result was the same. Assisi became a sanctuary where the hunted could find refuge. President Ronald Reagan would later honor this collective courage, noting in remarks delivered in 1983 that a single slip of the tongue by any informant could have condemned the entire town, yet not one person yielded to the temptation or pressure to betray their neighbors. As the first winter of occupation drew toward its close, the network had saved dozens of lives, but those involved knew that their work was far from finished. The German grip on Italy was tightening rather than loosening, and intelligence reaching Assisi suggested that the SS was becoming increasingly suspicious of the town's religious institutions. The initial phase of the rescue operation, characterized by a certain improvisation and learning through experience, would need to give way to something more systematic and secure. The conspirators understood that they were engaged in a long struggle, one that would require not only courage, but also cunning, patience, and an absolute commitment to the principle that every human life possessed infinite value. As winter began its slow transition towards spring, new challenges and dangers loomed on the horizon, testing the network's resolve and resourcefulness in ways they had not yet imagined. The transition from winter to spring in 1944 brought no relief to the tension that permeated every aspect of life in occupied Italy. If anything, the increasing pressure from Allied forces pushing up from the south intensified German paranoia and their determination to maintain absolute control over the territories they still held. The rescue network operating from Assisi had by now developed into a sophisticated underground organization, its methods refined through months of operation under the constant threat of discovery. Father Rufino Nicacci had emerged as the network's most active agent, a man who demonstrated remarkable adaptability in creating and maintaining the elaborate system of safe houses and false identities that kept hundreds of Jews alive. His work required him to move constantly between locations, coordinating the arrival of new refugees, ensuring adequate supplies for those already in hiding, and managing the complex logistics of an operation that grew more extensive with each passing week. The primary challenge facing the network was not simply finding hiding places, though this remained a constant concern, but rather maintaining those hiding places over an extended period. The initial emergency response of opening monastery and convent doors to refugees had been relatively straightforward, driven by the immediacy of the crisis following the October raid in Rome. However, as weeks turned into months, the practical difficulties of keeping hundreds of people hidden became increasingly apparent. Food supplies had to be obtained without arousing suspicion. A convent that suddenly required twice its normal allocation of bread and vegetables would inevitably attract attention from local authorities who might report unusual consumption patterns to German overseers. Father Brunacci, working from his position as bishop's secretary, developed relationships with local farmers and merchants who could be trusted to provide additional supplies without asking too many questions. These suppliers, while not necessarily aware of the full extent of the rescue operation, understood that they were contributing to resistance against the occupation, and most considered this contribution a moral obligation. The production of false documents by Luigi Brisi and his son Trento represented another crucial element in the network's operations. The forged identity papers they created were not simple affairs that could be dashed off in an afternoon. They required careful study of authentic documents to ensure that every detail, from the quality of paper to the specific stamps and signatures used by various municipal offices, matched what German inspectors would expect to see. Brisi's print shop became a laboratory where samples of official documents were analyzed, their characteristics catalogued and replicated. The printer developed contacts with sympathetic officials in various town halls who could provide information about current document formats and security features. Some of these officials went further, providing blank forms with authentic stamps that could be filled in with false information, creating documents that were technically genuine, even though the information they contained was completely fabricated. The psychological dimension of hiding represented perhaps the greatest challenge for the refugees themselves. Being forced to remain in confined spaces for months on end, cut off from normal social interactions and living in constant fear of discovery, took a tremendous toll on mental health. Parents struggled to keep children quiet and occupied in spaces where any unusual noise might attract unwanted attention. The monasteries and convents, designed for contemplative silence, paradoxically offered ideal environments for hiding, but the enforced stillness that was spiritually meaningful for monks and nuns became a source of stress for families unused to such discipline. Father Nicacci and the other coordinators recognized this challenge and worked to create moments of normalcy within the constraints of hiding. Children were given lessons by educated nuns and monks who found ways to continue their education despite the circumstances. Adults were encouraged to participate in the daily prayers and routines of the religious houses, not as an effort at conversion, but as a way of providing structure and meaning to days that might otherwise be consumed by anxiety and boredom. The question of religious identity and practice within the hiding places required sensitive navigation. While the rescue network was organized and led by Catholic clergy, they were clear that their mission was to preserve life, not to seek conversions. Jewish refugees were not pressured to abandon their faith or practices, though they were expected to maintain external appearances that would not compromise the safety of their hiding places. This meant that public displays of Jewish religious practice were impossible. There could be no gathering for Sabbath services, no visible observance of holidays, no singing of Hebrew prayers that might be overheard. Yet in quiet ways, the religious communities hosting these refugees found means to honor their guests' traditions. The Yom Kippur meal, prepared by the nuns in 1943, became a template for other observances. When Passover arrived in the spring of 1944, some convents made special arrangements to ensure that their Jewish guests could commemorate the holiday with at least minimal traditional elements. As the network's operations became more sophisticated, so too did the methods employed by German security forces seeking to uncover resistance activities. The SS in particular, under the command of officers trained in counterinsurgency techniques, began to pay closer attention to monasteries and convents, institutions they suspected of harboring not only Jews, but also escaped Allied prisoners of war and Italian military deserters. Random searches became more frequent, with German soldiers appearing at the gates of religious houses demanding to inspect the premises. These searches required the network to develop rapid response protocols. Hidden refugees needed to be moved to specially prepared concealment spaces within the buildings, areas that might escape casual inspection. Some monasteries featured ancient crypts and passages that could be quickly accessed. Others created false walls or concealed compartments in attics and cellars. The religious themselves had to maintain absolute composure during these inspections, showing neither nervousness nor excessive eagerness to assist, as either reaction might trigger suspicion. The case of the Kropp family illustrated both the dangers and the remarkable resourcefulness of the rescue network. The Kropps had arrived in Assisi in late 1943 with 3 young children, the youngest barely past infancy. Finding a suitable hiding place for a family with an infant presented unique challenges. Babies could not be relied upon to remain silent during German searches, and their needs for milk and clean diapers required resources that were increasingly difficult to obtain. Father Nicacci arranged for the Kropps to be hidden in the convent of the German Capuchin nuns, reasoning that the presence of German-speaking sisters might actually provide additional cover, as German soldiers would be less likely to suspect fellow Germans of harboring Jews. The choice proved inspired. On several occasions when SS units appeared at the convent, the Mother Superior engaged the officers in conversation in their native German, her fluent speech and Bavarian accent creating a sense of familiarity that deflected suspicion, while other sisters hurried the Kropp family into hiding. The network's operations extended beyond Assisi itself, to encompass a broader region of Umbria and neighboring provinces. Father Nicacci established connections with other priests and resistance figures in nearby towns, creating a chain of safe houses that could move refugees toward the advancing Allied lines in the south. This evacuation route, though extremely dangerous, offered hope to those refugees who felt that remaining in one place indefinitely was psychologically untenable or who had specific reasons for needing to reach Allied-controlled territory. The journey from Assisi to the front lines, a distance that in peacetime could be covered in a matter of hours, became a weeks-long odyssey involving dozens of handoffs between guides, hiding in barns and shepherd huts, and constant vigilance against German patrols. Not every attempt to run this gauntlet succeeded. Some refugees were captured during the journey, their fate sealed by a moment of bad luck or an informer's betrayal. Yet enough succeeded that the escape route remained a viable option throughout the occupation. Communication within the network relied on a mixture of traditional methods and careful improvisation. Telephone lines were monitored by German intelligence, making that form of communication too risky for sensitive matters. Instead, messages were passed through personal visits, coded notes delivered by trusted couriers, and prearranged signals that allowed coordinators to convey basic information without explicit verbal or written communication. Father Brunacci maintained a large personal library in his residence, and certain books on specific shelves became code for particular situations. A book moved from one position to another during a visitor's brief presence in the library could convey whether it was safe to proceed with a planned movement of refugees, or whether operations should be suspended due to increased German activity. These methods, while seemingly elaborate, were necessary to maintain security in an environment where a single intercepted message could unravel the entire network. The spring of 1944 also saw an evolution in the types of refugees seeking the network's help. In addition to Jewish families, the safe houses now sheltered escaped Allied prisoners of war, predominantly British and Commonwealth soldiers who had fled from prison camps after the Italian armistice. These military prisoners presented different challenges than Jewish refugees. They were typically young men in their 20s, used to action and frustrated by the enforced passivity of hiding. Father Nicacci found ways to channel their energy productively, using some of the prisoners as couriers between safe houses, reasoning that Italian-speaking Allied soldiers could move with somewhat less restriction than Jewish refugees, whose physical appearance might mark them as targets. The prisoners also brought military intelligence and news from the outside world. They had access to clandestine radio broadcasts from the BBC and could provide refugees with accurate information about the progress of the Allied campaign, news that helped sustain hope during the long months of waiting. One of the network's most ingenious strategies involved the creation of an entirely fictitious organization, complete with official-looking documents and stamps, purporting to be a relief committee authorized to assist displaced persons. This phantom organization, given a suitably bureaucratic name that suggested official sanction, allowed network members to move more openly in some circumstances. When questioned by Italian police or low-level German administrators about their activities, network members could produce documents showing their affiliation with this relief committee, documents impressive enough to satisfy cursory inspection, even though the organization itself existed only on paper. The strategy worked precisely because the German occupation administration, stretched thin across the Italian peninsula, relied heavily on documentation and bureaucratic procedure. Properly stamped papers, even if their content was complete fiction, carried a weight that could overcome casual scrutiny. As spring advanced toward summer, the military situation in Italy began to shift in ways that brought both hope and intensified danger. The Allied breakout from the Anzio beachhead in May 1944 and the subsequent liberation of Rome on June 4th represented a major turning point in the Italian campaign. For the refugees hiding in Assisi and across occupied Italy, the news of Rome's liberation was electrifying. Surely their own freedom was now only weeks away. Yet the reality proved more complex. The German forces, rather than collapsing, retreated to prepared defensive positions further north and determined to hold central Italy through the coming winter. This meant that towns like Assisi, which refugees had hoped would be liberated quickly, remained under occupation for months longer. The prolonged uncertainty tested the network's resources and the refugees' psychological resilience to their limits. In early May 1944, the network suffered its first major security breach. Father Brunacci was arrested by Rocchi Perugia, the provincial governor, who had been investigating suspicious activities centered on the bishop's residence. The arrest sent shockwaves through the rescue organization. If Brunacci could be made to reveal the network's structure and participants, the entire operation would collapse. Bishop Niccolini immediately intervened, using his ecclesiastical authority and personal connections to pressure Perugia for Brunacci's release. After several tense days during which the priest was interrogated but not physically harmed, he was freed, though forced to leave Assisi as a condition of his release. The incident served as a stark reminder of how precarious the network's existence remained. The margin between success and catastrophic failure was measured in moments of decision, strokes of luck, and the courage of individuals who refused to betray those dependent on them, even under the threat of their own suffering. The close call with Father Brunacci's arrest prompted a reorganization of the network's leadership structure. Rather than centralizing information and decision-making in a few key figures, the coordinators developed a more distributed system where knowledge was compartmentalized. Individual religious houses were given more autonomy in managing their hidden refugees, reducing the need for constant communication with central coordinators that might be intercepted or observed. This reorganization proved fortuitous as German counterintelligence efforts intensified through the late spring and early summer, with undercover agents attempting to infiltrate resistance networks by posing as refugees or sympathetic Italians seeking to join the cause. The compartmentalized structure made it difficult for infiltrators to gain a comprehensive picture of the network's extent, limiting the damage they could do even if they did manage to penetrate one or two safe houses. The summer of 1944 settled over Assisi with an oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the emotional and psychological pressure bearing down on everyone involved in the rescue network. By this point, the operation had been running for nearly a year, a duration that had seemed unimaginable when it began in the panicked weeks following the October raid on Rome's Jewish community. The initial emergency measures had evolved into a sustainable system, yet sustainability brought its own challenges, particularly the growing strain on resources and the accumulated psychological toll on both rescuers and rescued. Father Niccolini, who had thrown himself into the work with boundless energy, showed signs of exhaustion, his face thinner and more lined than it had been a year earlier. The weight of responsibility for hundreds of lives, the constant calculations of risk and safety, the sleepless nights wondering whether a decision made that day might lead to discovery and catastrophe, all of this had aged him beyond his 33 years. The moral and ethical dimensions of the rescue work occupied increasing space in the private thoughts and conversations of those directing the network. While the fundamental rightness of their cause was never in question among the conspirators, specific decisions often involved agonizing choices between competing goods or lesser evils. When a new refugee arrived at the gates of San Damiano or another safe house, Father Niccolini and his colleagues had to make rapid assessments. Could this person be successfully hidden? Did they have the temperament to endure months of confinement without endangering themselves and others? Were there sufficient resources to accommodate another person without compromising the safety of those already hidden? Sometimes the answer to these questions meant that refugees had to be turned away or directed elsewhere, decisions that haunted those who made them, knowing that rejection might mean the difference between life and deportation for the person seeking help. The relationship between the rescue network and the official Vatican position on the persecution of Jews represented another source of complexity and sometimes frustration for those working in the field. Pope Pius XII had maintained a public stance of neutrality regarding the specificities of Nazi persecution, refraining from explicit condemnation of the deportations even as evidence of systematic extermination became undeniable. This silence stemmed from multiple considerations: concern that direct confrontation might provoke even worse persecution, the traditional Vatican emphasis on diplomatic channels over public denunciation, and the complex political calculations involved in maintaining the Holy See's status as a neutral entity in a continent torn by total warfare. Yet privately, the Pope had authorized and encouraged efforts to aid persecuted Jews, channeling resources through carefully chosen intermediaries and giving tacit approval to bishops like Niccolini, who organized rescue operations in their dioceses. For Father Nicacci and the other rescuers working directly with refugees, this gap between public silence and private action created a peculiar tension. They understood the strategic reasons for Vatican discretion. A direct papal condemnation of Nazi policies might indeed provoke retaliation not only against Catholics in Germany, but also against the very rescue networks they were working to maintain. Yet there were moments when the burden of secrecy, of acting without official acknowledgement, weighed heavily. The rescuers could not publicly proclaim their actions. To do so would immediately compromise security and endanger everyone involved. They could not seek recognition or support from the broader Catholic community because such publicity would alert the Germans to their activities. They worked in silence, sustained by personal conviction and the knowledge that regardless of public acknowledgement, they were doing what their faith and conscience demanded. The personal relationships that developed between rescuers and refugees added emotional complexity to the enterprise. What had begun as an emergency response to persecution evolved into genuine human connections as months of proximity broke down the formal barriers between clergy and laypeople, between Catholics and Jews. The nuns who had initially opened their convents out of obedience to the bishop's directive found themselves becoming surrogate aunts and grandmothers to the children in their care. Father Nicacci, whose duties required him to visit multiple safe houses regularly, became a trusted friend to dozens of refugees, someone with whom they could share their fears and hopes. These relationships enriched the lives of everyone involved, but they also increased the emotional stakes of the rescue work. The refugees were no longer abstract figures to be protected, but friends and companions whose suffering was felt personally by those sheltering them. The Baruch family, hidden in the convent where Father Brunacci had his extensive library, illustrated this dynamic particularly well. Their teenage daughter Mira, a bright student whose education had been interrupted by persecution, became Brunacci's pupil in Latin during the long months of hiding. The priest, himself a scholar who treasured learning, found joy in teaching this eager student, watching her make rapid progress in a language that connected her to the ancient world and to the universal traditions of European culture. For Mira, these lessons represented more than simply a way to pass time. They were an affirmation that her life had meaning beyond mere survival, that she remained a person with intellectual aspirations and capabilities, despite the Nazis' determination to reduce her to less than human status. The bond between teacher and student exemplified the deeper purpose of the rescue work, not merely to keep people physically alive, but to preserve their human dignity and their connection to a world that extended beyond the immediate nightmare of persecution. As summer progressed, news from the wider world continued to bring a mixture of hope and frustration. The successful Allied invasion of Normandy in June had opened a second front in Western Europe, stretching German military resources and making it increasingly clear that Nazi Germany's ultimate defeat was now a matter of when rather than if. Yet in Italy, the advance remained agonizingly slow. The German defensive lines held firm, and each mile of territory gained by Allied forces came at enormous cost in lives and time. For those hiding in Assisi, the knowledge that liberation was eventually certain provided psychological sustenance, but the indefinite extension of their ordeal tested patience and resilience. Parents worried about the developmental impact on their children of spending their formative years in hiding. Young people mourned the normal adolescent experiences they were missing. Everyone struggled with the combination of enforced passivity and constant low-level anxiety that characterized life in the safe houses. The network coordinators understood that maintaining morale among the hidden refugees required active attention and creative thinking. Father Nicacci organized small cultural events within the safe houses, gatherings where refugees could share stories, songs, and memories of better times. Some of the hidden families included musicians who could play instruments or sing, and these talents became precious resources for communal evenings that temporarily lifted spirits and created islands of normalcy in the sea of abnormality that defined their daily existence. The religious houses adapted their routines to accommodate these needs. Convents that normally observed strict rules of silence designated certain hours when conversation was permitted, recognizing that human beings could not maintain psychological health under conditions of total isolation. Food scarcity became an increasingly serious concern as the occupation dragged on. The German occupation authorities requisitioned agricultural production for military use, leaving Italian civilians with minimal rations. For the rescue network, which had to feed not only the official members of religious houses, but also their hidden charges, obtaining adequate nutrition became a constant struggle. The contacts that Father Brunacci had cultivated with local farmers proved invaluable, as did the solidarity of townspeople who contributed from their own meager supplies, despite facing shortages themselves. Black market transactions, while financially costly and carrying their own risks, became necessary to supplement official rations. The network's financial resources, drawn from personal savings of refugees who had managed to preserve some wealth, contributions from sympathetic benefactors, and occasionally funds quietly channeled from Vatican sources, were carefully managed to ensure maximum impact. The health of hidden refugees presented another ongoing challenge. Medical care for people who officially did not exist in Assisi required creative solutions and cooperation from sympathetic physicians. Dr. Giuseppe Fortini, the town's primary doctor, was brought into the network's confidence and provided medical care to refugees when needed, often treating them in improvised circumstances within the convents and monasteries, rather than in his office where their presence might be noted. When serious medical situations arose requiring hospital care, the network had to make agonizing decisions about whether the risk of exposure was justified by the medical necessity. In at least one case, a refugee who required surgery was given temporary documentation, identifying them as a member of a religious order, allowing them to be treated at a Catholic hospital where sympathetic staff agreed to maintain the fiction. The psychological sophistication of the network's operations extended to understanding and managing the different needs of various age groups among the hidden refugees. Children required different considerations than adults. They needed not only physical care, but also age-appropriate activities and education to prevent developmental regression. The religious communities rose to this challenge with remarkable creativity. Nuns who had spent their adult lives in contemplative vocations discovered unsuspected talents as teachers and caregivers. Monks whose daily routines had revolved around prayer and manual labor found themselves organizing games and lessons for restless youngsters. Elderly refugees, who often struggled most with the physical hardships of hiding, received special attention and care, the religious recognizing that these elders represented a link to traditions and wisdom that must be preserved alongside the younger generations. The arrival of autumn brought an acute awareness that the rescue network would need to continue operations through a second winter of occupation. This realization required practical preparations, particularly regarding heating and winter clothing for refugees who had arrived with minimal possessions. The monasteries and convents, built of stone and often poorly insulated, would be brutally cold once winter arrived. Fuel for heating was scarce and closely monitored by occupation authorities. Religious houses could not suddenly double their fuel consumption without arousing suspicion. The network had to be creative, organizing work parties to gather wood from surrounding forests, pooling resources across multiple safe houses to maximize efficiency, and distributing the warmest rooms to the most vulnerable refugees, particularly the very young and very old. As the second anniversary of Italy's entry into the war as a co-belligerent with the Allies approached, the rescue network had saved hundreds of lives. Yet those involved in the work found little room for self-congratulation. Every day that passed without discovery was simply another day of successfully doing what they believed any decent person would do in their circumstances. Father Nicacci, when asked years later about his motivations, would consistently deflect praise, insisting that he had merely done what his faith required and what his conscience demanded. Bishop Niccolini, similarly, viewed the rescue work not as heroism, but as the natural outgrowth of Christian duty to protect the vulnerable. This humility characterized most of those involved in the network. They saw themselves not as heroes, but as ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances in the only way that seemed morally possible. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the rescue network had developed into what modern observers might recognize as a sophisticated underground operation, complete with specialized roles, secure communication protocols, and contingency planning for various emergency scenarios. Yet for all its increasing professionalization, the network remained fundamentally dependent on human courage and the willingness of individuals to place moral conviction above personal safety. The months of operation had taught the coordinators important lessons about security and efficiency, but they had also revealed the limits of planning and the need for improvisation when faced with unexpected challenges. It was during this period that the network's most creative solutions to the problem of smuggling refugees to safety began to emerge. Innovations born from necessity and implemented with a combination of careful preparation and desperate audacity. The basic challenge facing the network had evolved since its inception. Initially, the primary task had been finding hiding places for refugees within Assisi and its immediate surroundings. This work continued, but increasingly the coordinators faced requests from refugees who wanted to move beyond mere hiding toward active escape to Allied-controlled territory. The Allied advance, after stalling through the summer and autumn of 1944, had resumed with the spring offensive, and by late winter it was clear that German forces were gradually being pushed northward. This military reality created an opportunity. If refugees could be moved from Assisi toward the advancing Allied lines, they might reach freedom rather than simply waiting for liberation to eventually arrive. Father Nicacci took the lead in developing what became known within the network as the Southern Route, a series of way stations and safe houses extending from Assisi toward the front lines that shifted gradually northward as Allied forces advanced. Creating this escape corridor required establishing relationships with priests, farmers, and resistance fighters across a broad swath of territory, each contact representing a potential link in a chain that might lead to freedom. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Nicacci could not simply send letters or make telephone calls to recruit participants in distant towns, as such communication would be intercepted and used by German counterintelligence. Instead, he had to travel personally, making journeys across occupied territory to meet potential allies and assess their trustworthiness and capability. These journeys were fraught with danger. As an able-bodied man of military age, Nicacci was subject to detention by German patrols, and his lack of a plausible explanation for traveling through areas far from his monastery could easily lead to arrest and interrogation. To manage the risk, Nkachi adopted a series of disguises that would become legendary among those who knew his story. He traveled variously as a beggar, his clerical garb replaced by ragged civilian clothes and his normally clean-shaven face concealed beneath days of stubble. He posed as a postman, carrying an official-looking satchel and moving with the purposeful stride of someone on routine business. On one memorable occasion, he even dressed as a German soldier, wearing a uniform obtained through the black market and relying on his rudimentary German and authoritative manner to pass inspection at checkpoints. These disguises were more than simple costumes. They required Nkachi to fully inhabit the roles he was playing, to think and move and speak in ways consistent with his assumed identity. The priest discovered within himself an unexpected talent for this kind of performance, though he later attributed his success more to divine protection than to any personal skill at deception. The southern route, once established, operated on a relay system similar to the Underground Railroad that had smuggled enslaved people to freedom in antebellum America. Refugees would be moved from Assisi to a first-way station, typically a farm or rural parish a few miles distant, where they would rest for several days. From there, they would be handed off to another guide who would lead them to the next station, and so on, each leg of the journey covering relatively short distances to minimize the risk of encounter with German patrols. The guides who escorted refugees along these routes were often local people with intimate knowledge of the terrain, farmers who knew every path and stream in their districts, shepherds familiar with mountain trails that avoided main roads, partisans whose guerrilla activities had taught them how to move undetected through occupied territory. The network coordinated these movements carefully, with messages passed through secure channels to ensure that each way station knew when to expect refugees and that guides were prepared to receive and transfer their charges. Yet, even the most careful planning could not eliminate risk, and the southern route claimed its victims. Some refugees were captured during transit, betrayed by informers, or simply unlucky in their timing, encountering a German patrol at precisely the wrong moment. When word of such captures reached Assisi, it sent waves of anxiety through the safe houses. Those who had been captured knew the network's methods and might, under interrogation or torture, reveal information that could compromise ongoing operations. The network's compartmentalized structure provided some protection against such scenarios, as individual refugees typically knew only the specific safe houses where they had been hidden and the immediate guides who had helped them, not the broader network's extent or leadership. Nevertheless, each capture represented not only a personal tragedy, but also a potential security breach that required coordinators to adjust plans and possibly relocate other refugees whose positions might have been compromised. It was in this context of needing to move refugees with maximum security that the network developed its most audacious method, the use of coffins to smuggle people past German checkpoints. The idea, when first proposed, seemed almost impossibly risky, yet it possessed a certain grim logic. German soldiers, like most people, were reluctant to closely inspect the contents of coffins, particularly during an epidemic period when fears of contagion ran high. The occupation authorities required permits for the transportation of bodies, but these permits were relatively routine and attracted less scrutiny than other forms of documentation. Most importantly, a funeral procession possessed a certain inviolability in Italian culture. Even hardened German officers generally hesitated to disrupt such proceedings without extremely strong justification. The mechanics of coffin smuggling required careful choreography. A refugee needing to move through territory where normal travel was too dangerous would be placed inside a coffin with air holes drilled in strategic locations that would not be visible during casual inspection. The coffin would be loaded onto a hearse or cart, accompanied by a small group of mourners, typically including one or more members of the clergy whose presence added authenticity to the funeral procession. The procession would proceed toward its destination, passing through checkpoints where German soldiers, presented with documentation showing a permit for transporting a body for burial, would typically wave the hearse through without demanding that the coffin be opened. Upon reaching the destination, usually a church or monastery where sympathetic priests awaited, the coffin would be unloaded, carried inside, and once privacy was secured, opened to release the hidden refugee. The method was not without its challenges and limitations. Refugees traveling in coffins had to possess remarkable self-control, remaining absolutely still and silent, even when the natural human instinct would be to move or cry out. The time spent in the coffin, though typically only a few hours, felt eternal to those experiencing it. The darkness, the confined space, the difficulty breathing through small air holes, and the constant awareness that discovery would mean immediate arrest all combined to create an almost unbearable psychological ordeal. Children could not be transported this way, as they could not be relied upon to maintain the necessary stillness and silence. Even for adults, the method was reserved for special circumstances when other options were unavailable, as the physical and psychological toll was considerable. The first successful coffin smuggling operation, carried out in early 1945, involved a young Jewish man who needed to reach a monastery 40 kilometers south of Assisi. He had been hiding in a convent for over a year, but recent German activity in the area had made his position increasingly precarious. Normal travel was impossible. As a man of military age, without proper documentation showing exemption from labor conscription, he would be detained at the first checkpoint. Father Nicacci proposed the coffin method, explaining the risks candidly, but emphasizing that it might represent the refugee's best chance for survival. After a night of consideration, the young man agreed to attempt it. The following day, a carefully staged funeral procession left the convent, accompanying a coffin supposedly containing the body of a deceased elderly woman. The procession encountered 2 German checkpoints. At each, soldiers briefly examined the transport permit before waving the hearse through. At the destination monastery, the coffin was carried into the chapel, and once the doors were secured, opened to reveal the refugee, alive and shaken, but safe. The success of this first attempt led to the method being used several more times over the following months. Each operation carefully planned and executed, with the knowledge that a single mistake could be catastrophic. Beyond the coffin method, the network employed other creative transportation strategies. Some refugees were hidden in agricultural loads, buried beneath hay or vegetables in farm carts that could pass through checkpoints with less scrutiny than passenger vehicles. Others traveled concealed in ambulances, disguised as patients being transferred between medical facilities, a ruse that required cooperation from sympathetic medical personnel willing to forge transfer documents. The network even utilized legitimate religious pilgrimages as cover for moving refugees. A group of nuns traveling to a distant shrine might include several refugees dressed in religious habits, their presence explained as lay associates or postulants accompanying the sisters. Each method had its advantages and limitations, and part of Father Nicacci's growing expertise lay in matching the appropriate transportation method to specific circumstances and individual refugees. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought its own unique challenges beyond those of transportation. Fuel shortages across occupied Italy meant that even those with money and connections struggled to obtain adequate heating materials. The safe houses, already operating at maximum capacity, faced the prospect of trying to keep refugees warm through a brutal winter with minimal resources. Father Brunacci, who had returned to assist the network despite his earlier arrest and expulsion from Assisi, organized a systematic effort to gather wood from surrounding forests. Work parties of monks and trusted refugees made regular expeditions into the countryside, collecting fallen branches and dead wood that could be burned for heat. These expeditions required careful timing to avoid German patrols, and the work itself was exhausting, but the alternative, allowing refugees to freeze in unheated buildings, was unacceptable. Food scarcity reached critical levels during this period. The German retreat, while strategically inevitable, was being conducted with deliberate destructiveness. Wehrmacht units systematically demolished infrastructure and requisitioned or destroyed food supplies that might benefit advancing Allied forces. Italian civilians caught between the retreating Germans and advancing Allies suffered tremendously, and the hidden refugees, dependent on supplies from an already strained local population, faced genuine hunger. The network's coordinators made difficult decisions about resource allocation, prioritizing the most vulnerable, young children, pregnant women, and the elderly, for the best available food while asking others to accept even more meager rations. The solidarity of the Italian people, who themselves were often going hungry, proved remarkable. Families who had little gave what they could to support the hidden refugees, understanding that they were participating in collective resistance against an evil that threatened everyone. As winter gave way to the spring of 1945, everyone in occupied Italy could sense that the end was approaching. Allied forces were pushing northward with renewed momentum. German resistance was crumbling in the face of overwhelming material superiority, and reports from Germany itself suggested that the Nazi regime was in its death throes. Yet this period of approaching liberation was also one of maximum danger. Desperate German units, facing inevitable defeat, sometimes lashed out with particular viciousness against civilians suspected of resistance activities. SS units, knowing that they would likely face prosecution for their crimes once the war ended, had little incentive to show restraint. The rescue network maintained maximum vigilance during these final months, knowing that discovery now, after having survived so long, would be particularly tragic. The coordinators sent messages to all safe houses, emphasizing the need for continued caution and reminding everyone that liberation would come, but that they must survive until it arrived. The relationship between religious faith and resistance action formed the philosophical and spiritual core of the rescue network operating from Assisi, while the practical mechanisms of hiding refugees, creating false documents, and organizing escape routes could be understood in purely secular terms as resistance against tyranny. For those directly involved in the work, their actions represented the deepest expression of their Christian beliefs. Father Nicacci would later reflect that the rescue work was not something separate from his priestly vocation, but rather its most authentic manifestation. The commandment to love one's neighbor, the gospel injunction to welcome the stranger, the example of Christ himself, who identified with the persecuted and marginalized, all of these fundamental Christian teachings found their practical application in the daily work of protecting Jewish refugees. Bishop Niccolini approached the theological dimensions of the rescue work with characteristic scholarly precision. In private conversations with his closest collaborators, he articulated a theology of resistance that drew on centuries of Catholic moral teaching about the relationship between divine law and human authority. The bishop argued that when civil authorities commanded actions that directly contradicted divine commandments, Christians were not merely permitted, but obligated to refuse obedience. The Nazi policies toward Jews represented such a fundamental violation of divine law, the sanctity of human life, the unity of the human family under God, the special covenant between God and the Jewish people, that resistance became a moral imperative rather than an optional charitable act. This theological framework provided the rescue network with intellectual coherence and spiritual sustenance, transforming what might have been seen as mere humanitarian work into an act of religious devotion. The practical application of these theological principles sometimes required the network's leaders to make decisions that challenged conventional religious boundaries. The most obvious example was the admission of men into female convents and women into male monasteries, violations of enclosure rules that under normal circumstances would have been considered serious breaches of monastic discipline. Yet Bishop Niccolini used his ecclesiastical authority to grant dispensations for these arrangements, arguing that the preservation of human life took precedence over conventional monastic regulations. The religious communities themselves embraced this theological reasoning. Nuns, who had spent decades in strict enclosure, welcomed male refugees with genuine warmth, seeing in these unexpected guests an opportunity to serve Christ in the person of the persecuted. Monks whose lives had been dedicated to contemplative withdrawal from the world discovered that the world had come to them in the form of families seeking sanctuary, and they responded with the same devotion they brought to their prayers. The question of Jewish religious practice within Catholic safe houses required careful navigation of theological and practical considerations. The rescue network's organizers were adamant that they sought to preserve life, not to seek conversions, and they went to considerable lengths to respect the religious integrity of those they were helping. When possible, arrangements were made for Jewish refugees to maintain their traditional observances. Kosher food requirements were accommodated within the constraints of wartime rationing, and spaces were designated where Jewish prayers could be recited privately. The nuns who prepared the special meal for Yom Kippur represented this approach at its most generous. Without being asked and without expecting any acknowledgement, they had taken the initiative to honor their guests' most sacred day. For many of the Jewish refugees, these gestures of respect for their traditions, coming from Catholic religious who might have been expected to see Judaism as a superseded faith, represented profound acts of recognition and solidarity. The interfaith dimension of the rescue work created opportunities for theological dialogue that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Jewish refugees, many of whom were well educated and deeply versed in their own religious traditions, found themselves in extended conversations with Catholic priests and nuns who were equally committed to their faith. These discussions, conducted in the intimate setting of the safe houses and with the shared experience of persecution as a backdrop, achieved a depth of mutual understanding that transcended formal interfaith relations. Father Brunacci, whose extensive library became a resource for both Catholic and Jewish study, facilitated many of these conversations, finding that the enforced leisure of hiding created opportunities for reflection that might never have existed in peacetime. The young woman Mira, studying Latin with Brunacci, represented thousands of such relationships where intellectual and spiritual exchange flourished despite, or perhaps because of, the extreme circumstances. The network's relationship with the broader Catholic hierarchy remained complex throughout the war period. While Bishop Niccolini had received authorization from Rome to undertake rescue work, the Vatican's public position of neutrality meant that official support had to remain carefully concealed. Pope Pius XIV's strategy of working through individual bishops and local networks, rather than issuing public proclamations, reflected both diplomatic calculation and practical wisdom. Direct papal condemnation of Nazi policies might have provoked retaliation that would have made rescue work impossible. Yet for those working directly with refugees, this policy of public silence sometimes created feelings of isolation and frustration. They knew that their work had papal approval, but they could not cite that approval publicly or use it to rally broader Catholic support. The necessity of operating in secret, while essential for security, also meant that the rescue network could not become a rallying point for Catholic resistance to Nazi persecution. As the war entered its final phase in early 1945, the rescue network faced new challenges related to the approaching liberation. Allied forces were clearly winning the conflict, but their advance remained frustratingly slow. And it was becoming apparent that even after German military defeat, the process of rebuilding shattered lives would be enormously complex. Many of the Jewish refugees who had survived in hiding discovered that they had lost not only their homes and possessions, but also family members who had been deported or killed during the occupation. The network's coordinators found themselves dealing not only with the immediate challenges of maintaining security and supplies, but also with the psychological trauma of people who were beginning to confront the full extent of their losses. The priests and nuns who had provided shelter discovered that their role was evolving from that of protectors to that of counselors and companions in grief. The liberation of Rome on June 4, 1944, had provided tremendous psychological boost to the rescue network, but it also highlighted the uneven nature of the Allied advance. Rome's freedom meant that the papal authority could operate more openly in supporting rescue efforts, and resources began to flow more freely to networks still operating in occupied territory. Yet towns like Assisi remained under German control for months after Rome's liberation, creating a complex situation where some rescue networks were operating openly while others maintained absolute secrecy. Father Nicacci and his colleagues had to balance hope for imminent liberation with the practical necessity of continuing operations as if the occupation might last indefinitely. This psychological balancing act, maintaining both optimism and vigilance, required remarkable emotional discipline from everyone involved in the network. The approach of spring 1945 brought increasing signs that German control was weakening. Communication between German units became sporadic. Supply lines were constantly interrupted by partisan attacks, and the occupying forces showed increasing signs of demoralization. Yet this apparent weakening of German authority also brought new dangers. Desperate soldiers might lash out unpredictably, and SS units facing inevitable defeat had little incentive to show restraint. The rescue network's coordinators sent urgent messages to all safe houses, emphasizing that the period immediately before liberation might be the most dangerous of all. Refugees who had survived months or years of hiding could still be killed or deported in the final weeks of occupation if they relaxed their vigilance prematurely. Throughout this final period, the spiritual dimension of the rescue work became increasingly prominent in the thoughts and conversations of those involved. Many of the rescuers spoke later of feeling that they had been participants in something larger than themselves, that their individual actions had been part of a divine plan that transcended human understanding. Father Nicacci, reflecting on the network's success in saving hundreds of lives, consistently attributed their achievements to divine providence rather than human cleverness. The fact that the network had operated for over a year without a single major security breach, that hundreds of refugees had been successfully hidden or transported to safety, that the broader Assisi population had maintained silence despite the obvious presence of strangers, all of this seemed to suggest a kind of miraculous protection that exceeded what ordinary human precautions could have achieved. The theological implications of the rescue work extended beyond the immediate wartime context to broader questions about the relationship between different religious traditions. The success of Catholic institutions in sheltering Jewish refugees challenged anti-Semitic interpretations of Christianity that had provided ideological support for persecution. The image of nuns preparing Yom Kippur meals for Jewish guests, of monks teaching refugee children alongside their traditional duties, of priests risking their lives to transport Jews to safety. These scenes represented a practical theology of solidarity that transcended traditional religious boundaries. For many of the Catholic rescuers, their work with Jewish refugees deepened their understanding of Christianity's Jewish roots and strengthened their appreciation for the ongoing validity of Jewish faith and practice. The rescue network's approach to children represented perhaps the most profound expression of their theological convictions. The decision to hide Jewish children in Catholic institutions, knowing that these children might be separated from their families for extended periods, required careful consideration of both immediate safety and long-term welfare. The nuns who cared for these children approached their responsibility with deep seriousness, understanding that they were serving not only as temporary guardians, but as custodians of Jewish identity and tradition. They made efforts to preserve the children's connection to their heritage, teaching them about their families' backgrounds, maintaining records of their true identities, and preparing them for eventual reunion with surviving relatives. This approach reflected a theological understanding that saw their role not as potential converters, but as protectors of the divine image reflected in every child, regardless of religious background. The winter of 1945 brought an acceleration in both the pace of military operations and the desperation of the rescue network's activities. Allied forces, reinforced and resupplied after the difficult mountain campaigns of the previous year, began their final push toward the Po Valley with renewed determination. The German armies, increasingly outnumbered and cut off from reliable supply lines, faced the prospect of either mounting a final stand that would likely prove futile or conducting an organized withdrawal that might preserve some remnant of their forces for the defense of Germany itself. For the rescue network centered in Assisi, this military situation created both unprecedented opportunities and equally unprecedented dangers. The approaching liberation meant that refugees who had endured months or years of hiding might finally see freedom. But the chaotic conditions of retreat and advance also meant that individual acts of violence or betrayal could still prove fatal, even as the broader war neared its conclusion. Father Nicacci found himself coordinating the network's most ambitious operations during this period, efforts that went beyond simple hiding to active evacuation toward Allied lines. The southern route that he had spent months developing now carried a steady stream of refugees moving from safe house to safe house, each step bringing them closer to territories already liberated by advancing Allied forces. The journey remained perilous. German units in retreat often moved unpredictably, and the no-man's land between German and Allied positions was swept by artillery fire and patrolled by nervous soldiers from both sides. Yet the psychological impact of movement toward freedom, after months of enforced passivity and hiding, proved enormous for many refugees. They were finally taking active steps toward liberation, rather than simply waiting for it to arrive. The logistics of these evacuation operations required unprecedented coordination between the rescue network and partisan groups operating in the countryside. The partisans, who had spent the occupation years developing their own networks of safe houses and supply routes, possessed invaluable knowledge about German patrol patterns and the location of Allied forward positions. Yet cooperation between the Catholic Rescue Network and the predominantly secular or communist partisans was not automatic. Ideological differences and mutual suspicions had to be overcome in the interest of saving lives. Father Nicacci proved particularly skilled at these negotiations. His evident sincerity and single-minded focus on humanitarian goals, winning respect even from partisan leaders who were skeptical of clerical involvement in resistance activities. The priest's willingness to take personal risks, demonstrated through his frequent journeys in disguise across dangerous territory, earned him credibility that transcended political and religious boundaries. The establishment of the evacuation route also required unprecedented financial resources, moving people across occupied territory, providing them with food and shelter during extended journeys, and compensating guides who risked their lives escorting refugees, all demanded funds that far exceeded the network's original modest requirements. The rescue operation had initially been financed through small donations from sympathetic local people, contributions from refugees who had managed to preserve some wealth, and occasional quiet transfers from Vatican sources. Now, with dozens of people moving through the evacuation route each week, the network needed substantial and reliable funding. Father Nicacci developed relationships with wealthy Italian families who, while not directly involved in rescue work, were willing to contribute financially to operations that undermined German control. Some of these donors were motivated by anti-German sentiment rather than specific concern for Jewish refugees, but their money proved equally valuable regardless of their motivations. The complexity of evacuation operations revealed the extraordinary attention to detail that successful rescue work required. Each refugee moving through the southern route needed multiple sets of identity documents to account for different checkpoints and administrative boundaries they might encounter. Luigi Brizzi and his son Trento, whose printing operation had become increasingly sophisticated over the months of operation, now produced documents of remarkable variety and authenticity. They created not only basic identity cards, but also travel permits, medical certificates, work authorizations, and even military discharge papers, each document crafted to provide plausible explanations for why particular individuals might be found in specific locations. The printers studied captured German documents to understand security features and developed techniques for reproducing official stamps and signatures with such accuracy that their forgeries could pass detailed inspection. The evacuation route's success depended critically on the performance of guides who escorted refugees between safe houses. These men and women, drawn from various backgrounds including local farmers, partisan fighters, and members of the clergy, possessed different skills and temperaments that had to be matched carefully to specific evacuation assignments. Some guides excelled at moving through rural areas, using their knowledge of mountain paths and forest trails to avoid German patrols. Others were more effective in urban environments, able to blend with civilian populations and navigate complex checkpoint systems. Father Nicacci developed detailed profiles of available guides, noting their strengths and limitations, and assigned them to evacuation missions that matched their capabilities. The priest also established backup systems so that if a guide was arrested or killed, alternative escorts could be quickly mobilized to prevent refugees from being stranded at intermediate points along the route. The psychological preparation of refugees for evacuation journeys represented another crucial element in the network's operations. Many of the people who had been hiding in monasteries and convents for months had developed a kind of institutional dependence, finding security in the familiar routines and enclosed spaces of the religious houses. The prospect of leaving these sanctuaries for the uncertainties of travel toward Allied lines created anxiety, even among refugees who desperately wanted freedom. Father Nicacci and the other coordinators spent considerable time counseling refugees about what to expect during evacuation, preparing them mentally for the physical hardships and psychological stresses they would encounter. These conversations also served as final security briefings, ensuring that refugees understood the importance of following their guides' instructions precisely and maintaining cover stories consistently throughout their journeys. The network's evacuation operations achieved remarkable success rates, with over 80% of refugees who attempted the journey reaching Allied-controlled territory safely. Yet each failed evacuation attempt weighed heavily on the consciences of those who had organized and supported it. When refugees were captured during transit, the network's coordinators felt personal responsibility for the consequences, even though they understood that the alternative, indefinite hiding with no prospect of freedom, was psychologically unsustainable for many people. Father Nicacci maintained detailed records of successful and unsuccessful evacuations, studying the patterns to identify factors that contributed to success or failure. These analyses led to constant refinements in procedures, changes in route selection, and improvements in the training provided to guides and refugees. The spring offensive launched by Allied forces in April 1945 created a fundamentally new situation for the rescue network. The rapid advance of Allied armies meant that areas which had required dangerous evacuation journeys in March were liberated through military action in April. Towns that the network had considered unreachable became Allied staging areas for further advances. This shifting military situation required constant updates to evacuation routes and destination points, as safe houses that had been behind German lines suddenly found themselves in liberated territory. Father Nikachi and his colleagues had to maintain communication networks that could provide real-time information about military positions and safe travel corridors, a challenging task given the fluid nature of the front lines. The liberation of various towns and regions also created opportunities for reuniting refugees with family members who had been separated during the chaos of persecution and hiding. The rescue network had maintained careful records of the refugees they had assisted, including information about family connections and pre-war addresses. As liberated areas came under Allied control, these records became valuable resources for displaced persons organizations seeking to reconnect families. Father Nikachi worked closely with Jewish community organizations and Allied relief agencies to share information about refugee locations and movements. Many of the reunions facilitated through these efforts were joyful occasions, but others were marked by the grief of learning about family members who had not survived. The approaching end of the war also forced the rescue network to confront questions about the future of their operations. The immediate goal of preserving life during active persecution was clearly being achieved, but many refugees faced enormous challenges in rebuilding their lives after liberation. Homes and businesses had been destroyed or confiscated, documents and possessions had been lost, and entire communities had been scattered or eliminated. The network's coordinators recognized that their responsibilities would not end with liberation, but would continue in different forms as they helped refugees transition from survival to reconstruction. Monasteries and convents that had served as hiding places began preparing to serve as temporary housing for displaced persons, while more permanent arrangements could be made. The administrative challenges of transitioning from clandestine to open operations were substantial. During the occupation, the rescue network had deliberately avoided creating extensive documentation that might compromise security if discovered. Now, with liberation approaching, they needed to reconstruct detailed records of their activities to assist with refugee identification and family reunification efforts. The careful destruction of documents that had protected the network during wartime now complicated efforts to provide refugees with proof of their experiences and assistance in obtaining official recognition. Father Nikachi and his colleagues worked intensively to recreate records from memory and from fragments of documentation that had been preserved. By late April 1945, the military situation in central Italy was changing almost daily. German resistance was collapsing as communication lines were cut and supply routes were interdicted by advancing Allied forces. The rescue network received reports that some German units were attempting to negotiate local surrenders rather than continuing hopeless resistance. Yet other German forces, particularly SS units, were reportedly becoming more dangerous as defeat became inevitable, lashing out at civilian populations in acts of desperation or revenge. The network's coordinators maintained maximum security precautions even as liberation appeared imminent, knowing that the final days of occupation could prove as dangerous as any period they had experienced. The psychological atmosphere within the safe houses during this period was complex and emotionally charged. Refugees who had endured months or years of confinement were understandably eager for freedom, yet they were also anxious about what they would find when they emerged from hiding. Many had received no word about family members or friends since the early days of persecution, and the uncertainty about survival and loss created a mixture of hope and dread. The religious communities that had sheltered these refugees shared in both the anticipation and the anxiety, knowing that liberation would bring joy, but also separation from people who had become integral parts of their communities. The bonds formed during the long months of shared danger and enforced intimacy would not be easily broken. As Allied artillery could be heard in the distance, growing closer each day, everyone involved in the rescue network understood that they were witnessing the final act of a drama that had consumed years of their lives and tested every aspect of their character and faith. The success of their efforts, hundreds of lives saved, families preserved, human dignity maintained in the face of systematic dehumanization, represented an achievement that would define their understanding of themselves and their purpose for the rest of their lives. Yet they also knew that the full accounting of what had been gained and lost during these years would take much longer to comprehend. The morning of June 12, 1945, dawned clear and bright over Assisi, carrying with it sounds that the town's residents had not heard for nearly 2 years. The rumble of Allied tanks moving along the roads below Mount Subasio, the voices of soldiers speaking English and calling out greetings to Italian civilians, and most remarkably, the complete absence of German commands or the harsh mechanical noise of Wehrmacht vehicles. The liberation of Assisi came not with dramatic battle, but with the quiet withdrawal of the remaining German garrison during the night, a retreat that left the town's ancient streets empty of occupying forces for the first time since September 1943. For the rescue network that had operated in secret for nearly 2 years, this moment represented not just military victory, but the successful completion of one of the most remarkable humanitarian operations of the entire war. Father Nicacci stood in the courtyard of San Damiano Monastery as the first Allied reconnaissance units made their way through Assisi's narrow medieval streets. The priest, whose disguises and clandestine journeys had made him perhaps the most recognizable figure in the underground network, could finally move openly without fear of arrest or interrogation. Yet the emotions he experienced were more complex than simple relief. After nearly 2 years of constant vigilance and split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people, the sudden absence of danger felt almost disorienting. The habits of secrecy and caution that had become second nature would take time to abandon, and the psychological transition from underground operative to peacetime priest would prove as challenging as any disguise he had worn during the occupation. The immediate aftermath of liberation brought a flood of activity as the hidden refugees began to emerge from their places of concealment. Monastery doors that had been locked and guarded for months swung open to reveal dozens of men, women and children who blinked in the sudden sunlight like people emerging from caves. The joy of freedom was unmistakable, yet it was tempered by uncertainty about what came next. Many refugees had lost contact with family members years earlier and had no idea who had survived or where they might be found. The rescue network's coordinators found themselves transitioning from the role of protectors to that of counselors and advocates, helping refugees navigate the complex administrative processes involved in establishing new identities and seeking displaced relatives. The scale of the network's achievements became apparent only gradually as detailed records were compiled in the weeks following liberation. Over the course of nearly 2 years of operation, the Assisi Rescue Network had provided shelter, protection, and assistance to more than 300 Jewish refugees. This number included entire families who had been hidden together, as well as individuals who had been separated from their relatives and cared for independently. In addition to Jewish refugees, the network had also assisted dozens of escaped Allied prisoners of war, Italian military deserters, and political refugees fleeing fascist persecution. The fact that this extensive operation had continued for such a long period without a single major security breach that resulted in mass arrests represented an achievement that amazed even those who had been directly involved. The reunion of refugee families represented some of the most emotionally powerful moments of the immediate post-liberation period. The Viterbi family, who had lived under false identities for nearly 2 years, were among the first to reclaim their true names and begin searching for relatives who had been scattered across Europe. Their daughter, who had grown from childhood to adolescence during the years of hiding, struggled to reconcile her memories of pre-war life with the experiences that had shaped her during the occupation. For many of the children who had been hidden in the monasteries and convents, the religious communities that had sheltered them had become their primary families, and the prospect of leaving these familiar environments created anxiety, even as they celebrated their freedom. The documentation of the network's activities presented significant challenges in the immediate aftermath of liberation. The very security measures that had protected the operation during the occupation, minimal written records, compartmentalized information, coded communications, now complicated efforts to provide comprehensive accounts of what had been accomplished. Father Nikachi and the other coordinators worked intensively to reconstruct detailed records, interviewing refugees, consulting with safe house operators, and piecing together the complex chronology of rescues, movements, and evacuations that had characterized their work. These documentation efforts were motivated not only by historical interest, but also by practical necessities. Refugees needed official recognition of their experiences to qualify for assistance programs, and the rescue network's members sought acknowledgement of their contributions to the resistance effort. The broader Italian population's response to revelations about the rescue network's activities was overwhelmingly positive, though tinged with amazement that such extensive operations had been conducted without their knowledge. Many residents of Assisi admitted that they had suspected something unusual was occurring in the town's religious institutions, but few had grasped the full scope of the rescue efforts. The fact that hundreds of refugees had been hidden in their midst for nearly 2 years without significant incident spoke to the effectiveness of the network's security measures and to the discipline and solidarity of the broader community. Local officials who had cooperated with the network, either actively or through deliberate blindness to suspicious activities, were recognized as having played crucial roles in the operation's success. The international recognition of the Assisi Rescue Network began almost immediately after liberation, as Allied intelligence officers and war correspondents learned about the scale and sophistication of the operation. Reports about the network's activities appeared in newspapers across Europe and North America, often focusing on the dramatic elements of the story: the coffin smuggling, the elaborate disguises, the narrow escapes from German detection. Yet these early accounts, while capturing public attention, often missed the deeper significance of what had been achieved: the creation of a humanitarian operation that transcended religious and cultural boundaries in service of fundamental human values. The rescue network represented not just successful resistance to Nazi persecution, but a practical demonstration of the possibility of cooperation between different communities in defense of shared principles. Father Nikachi's personal role in the network's operations received particular attention from journalists and military investigators documenting resistance activities. The priest's combination of spiritual conviction, practical intelligence, and personal courage had made him an ideal coordinator for the complex and dangerous work of rescue operations. Yet Nikachi himself consistently deflected personal praise, emphasizing that the network's success had depended on the contributions of dozens of individuals and the cooperation of entire religious communities. His insistence on sharing credit reflected both personal humility and a deeper understanding that the rescue work had succeeded precisely because it had been a collective effort rather than the achievement of any single heroic figure. The theological and philosophical implications of the rescue network's work became subjects of extensive discussion within Catholic intellectual circles in the months following liberation. The successful cooperation between Catholic institutions and Jewish refugees challenged traditional theological categories and provided concrete examples of what interfaith solidarity might look like in practice. The fact that nuns had prepared Yom Kippur meals for Jewish guests, that monks had taught refugee children about their own religious traditions, and that priests had risked their lives to transport Jews to safety represented a practical theology of human dignity that transcended sectarian boundaries. These examples influenced broader Catholic thinking about relations with other religious communities and contributed to theological developments that would eventually find expression in the Second Vatican Council. The long-term psychological impact of the rescue experience on both rescuers and rescued became apparent only gradually, as the immediate excitement of liberation gave way to the more complex challenges of reconstructing normal life. Many of the refugees who had been hidden in Assisi carried with them deep gratitude toward the religious communities that had sheltered them, but they also bore the psychological scars of persecution and displacement that would influence their lives for decades. The trauma of having been hunted, of having lived in constant fear of discovery, of having lost family members and possessions, could not be erased by liberation. Similarly, the priests and nuns who had participated in the rescue work found that their wartime experiences had permanently changed their understanding of their religious vocations and their relationship to the broader world. The practical challenges of helping refugees rebuild their lives extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of liberation. Many of the Jews who had been hidden in Assisi discovered that their pre-war homes and businesses had been destroyed or confiscated, that their communities had been scattered or eliminated, and that the social networks that had sustained them before persecution no longer existed. The rescue network's coordinators recognized that their responsibilities continued in different forms, and they worked to establish connections between refugees and relief organizations that could provide long-term assistance. Some monasteries and convents continued to house former refugees for months after liberation, serving as bridges between the emergency conditions of wartime hiding and the gradual process of re-establishing independent lives. The documentation and preservation of the rescue network's history became an important priority for its participants in the years following the war. Father Nicacci and other coordinators understood that their experiences contained valuable lessons about human capacity for both good and evil, about the practical requirements of effective resistance to persecution, and about the possibilities for cooperation across religious and cultural boundaries. They worked with historians and journalists to ensure that accurate accounts of their activities were preserved, correcting sensationalized or romanticized versions that appeared in popular media. These documentation efforts were motivated partly by a desire to honor the memory of those who had not survived persecution, and partly by hope that future generations might learn from both the horrors and the heroism of the wartime period. The recognition of the rescue network's participants by various governments and organizations continued for decades after the war's end. Father Nicacci received numerous honors, including recognition from the Israeli government as righteous among the nations, an award given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Bishop Niccolini, Luigi Brizzi, and other key figures in the network received similar recognition, though many of them accepted these honors reluctantly, maintaining that they had simply done what any decent person would do in similar circumstances. The collective modesty of the rescue network's participants became one of its most striking characteristics, a humility that seemed to grow from their understanding that they had been part of something larger than themselves. The influence of the Assisi Rescue Network extended beyond its immediate wartime achievements to broader questions about moral responsibility and social action. The network's success demonstrated that even in the most extreme circumstances, Individuals and communities possess the capacity to choose compassion over compliance, courage over safety, and human solidarity over narrow self-interest. These lessons proved relevant not only to understanding the Holocaust period, but also to later situations where civilian populations faced persecution and where ordinary people had to decide whether to remain passive or to take action in defense of human rights. The example of Assisi became a reference point for discussions about moral courage and the practical requirements of effective humanitarian intervention. As the years passed and the wartime generation aged, the preservation of the rescue network's memory became increasingly important to those who had participated in it. Annual commemorations were established to honor both the rescuers and the rescued, bringing together survivors and their descendants to share memories and ensure that the lessons of the wartime period were not forgotten. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities for continued healing from wartime trauma, they educated younger generations about the Holocaust and resistance to it, and they maintained connections between communities that had been brought together by extraordinary circumstances. The friendships formed during the months of shared danger proved to be among the most enduring relationships in many participants' lives. In the decades that followed the liberation of Assisi, the story of the rescue network evolved from wartime reality to historical memory, its significance deepening rather than diminishing with the passage of time. Father Rufino Nicacci, who returned to his quiet duties at San Damiano after the war's end, lived to see his wartime actions recognized internationally, though he never ceased to express amazement that activities he considered simple Christian duty had attracted such attention. The priest, who died in 1948 at the age of 37, had spent only 5 years of his short life involved in rescue work. Yet those years defined his legacy and provided inspiration for countless others who faced their own moral challenges in subsequent decades. Bishop Giuseppe Placido Nicolini continued to lead the Diocese of Assisi until his death in 1973, his 3 decades of post-war service marked by the same quiet dignity and pastoral concern that had characterized his wartime leadership. The bishop never wrote extensively about the rescue network's activities, preferring to let others document what had occurred while he focused on the ongoing needs of his diocesan community. Yet his influence on Catholic thinking about social justice and interfaith relations extended far beyond Assisi, as the theological principles he had articulated during the resistance period continue to shape discussions about the Church's role in protecting human rights. The refugees who had been sheltered in Assisi carried their experiences with them as they rebuilt their lives in the post-war world. Many emigrated to other countries, particularly the United States and Israel, where they established new families and careers while maintaining connections to the Italian town that had provided them sanctuary. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the monks and nuns who had risked everything to protect strangers, accounts that shaped their understanding of human possibility and moral responsibility. Some of these descendants returned to Assisi as adults, seeking to understand the places where their families had been hidden and to express gratitude that could never be adequately conveyed in words. The broader historical significance of the Assisi Rescue Network became clearer as scholars developed more comprehensive understanding of Holocaust-era rescue efforts. While the dramatic stories of individual heroes like Oskar Schindler and Raoul Wallenberg captured public attention, historians recognized that the majority of Jews who survived Nazi persecution owed their lives to networks of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. The Assisi network exemplified this pattern, demonstrating how institutional resources, community solidarity, and individual courage could combine to create effective resistance to systematic persecution. The network's success rate, over 300 refugees sheltered with no major security breaches, compared favorably with any similar operation documented from the wartime period. The methodological innovations developed by the Assisi network, from the sophisticated document forgery operation to the coffin smuggling technique, influenced post-war understanding of clandestine operations and humanitarian intervention. Military historians studying resistance movements found valuable lessons in the network's approach to security, communication, and operational planning. Social scientists examining the conditions that enable moral courage identified factors present in Assisi: strong institutional leadership, clear ethical frameworks, community solidarity that appeared crucial to successful resistance against persecution. These analytical insights proved relevant not only to understanding the Holocaust period, but also to addressing later situations where civilian populations faced systematic persecution. The theological legacy of the rescue network continued to influence Catholic thought about interfaith relations and social justice throughout the post-war period. The practical cooperation between Catholic institutions and Jewish refugees had demonstrated possibilities for religious solidarity that transcended traditional theological boundaries. The Second Vatican Council's declaration Nostra Aetate, which revolutionized Catholic teaching about relations with Judaism, drew on examples like the Assisi network to support its argument that Christians and Jews shared fundamental spiritual bonds. The Council's emphasis on human dignity and religious freedom reflected theological insights that had been tested practically by rescuers who had risked everything to protect persecuted neighbors. The physical spaces where the rescue network had operated became sites of memory and pilgrimage in the decades following the war. The monasteries and convents that had sheltered refugees installed plaques and memorial displays documenting their wartime roles, creating opportunities for visitors to reflect on the moral challenges faced by ordinary people during extraordinary times. San Damiano, where Father Nicacci had coordinated much of the network's activities, became a particular focus for such commemoration. Its connection to both St. Francis and the wartime rescue efforts, creating layers of meaning that resonated with pilgrims from many different backgrounds. These memorial efforts served not only to honor the past, but also to challenge contemporary visitors to consider their own potential responses to moral crises. The educational impact of the Assisi story extended far beyond Italy, as the network's history was incorporated into Holocaust education programs around the world. Teachers found that the story of Catholic rescuers and Jewish refugees provided powerful illustrations of both human cruelty and human compassion, helping students understand that the Holocaust period involved choices made by individuals who faced genuine moral dilemmas. The complexity of the rescue network's operations, the careful planning, the psychological challenges, the constant risk calculations helped students appreciate that effective resistance to persecution required not only good intentions, but also practical skills and sustained commitment. These educational applications ensured that the network's legacy would continue to influence new generations long after the original participants had died. The relationships formed between rescuers and refugees during the wartime period proved to be among the most enduring legacies of the network's operations. Many refugees maintained correspondence with the religious communities that had sheltered them, sending photographs of children and grandchildren to nuns who had cared for them during their darkest hours. Some refugees returned to Assisi regularly, participating in the daily life of the monasteries and convents as extended members of religious families that had been formed under the most extraordinary circumstances. These ongoing relationships demonstrated that the rescue network had created not only physical sanctuary, but also spiritual bonds that transcended the immediate crisis that had brought people together. The documentation of the network's activities continued to evolve as historians gained access to previously unavailable sources and as surviving participants shared memories they had not previously disclosed. Archives in various countries yielded documents that filled gaps in the chronological record, while oral history projects captured personal testimonies from both rescuers and rescued. These ongoing documentation efforts revealed the extent to which the Assisi network had been connected to similar operations throughout Italy and across Europe, suggesting that rescue activities were more extensive and better coordinated than had been previously understood. The gradual emergence of this broader picture enhanced appreciation for the network's achievements, while also highlighting the tragic reality that such efforts, despite their success, could save only a small fraction of those who were persecuted. The moral questions raised by the rescue network's experiences continued to resonate in contemporary discussions about humanitarian intervention and moral responsibility. The network's participants had faced fundamental choices about risk and safety, about individual versus collective responsibility, and about the proper relationship between religious conviction and political action. These dilemmas had no simple answers during the wartime period, and they continued to challenge people facing similar situations in later decades. The example of Assisi provided not prescriptive solutions, but rather inspiration for moral courage and practical guidance about the conditions that enable effective humanitarian action. As the 21st century progressed and the last survivors of the wartime period passed away, the responsibility for preserving the network's memory shifted to new generations who had not experienced the events directly. Museums, educational institutions, and memorial organizations worked to ensure that the story of the Assisi Rescue Network would continue to be told accurately and meaningfully. Digital archives made documentary materials more widely accessible, while virtual reality technologies began to offer immersive experiences that could help contemporary audiences understand the physical and psychological conditions of wartime hiding. These technological innovations ensured that the network's legacy would remain accessible even as the human witnesses to its activities were no longer available to share their personal testimony. The ultimate significance of the Assisi Rescue Network lay not in its uniqueness, but in its demonstration of human potential for moral greatness under extreme circumstances. The network's participants were not extraordinary people by conventional standards. They were priests and nuns, printers and farmers, officials and ordinary citizens who found themselves confronting choices between compliance and conscience. Their decision to choose compassion over safety, solidarity over self-interest, and human dignity over authoritarian command created a legacy that transcended their immediate achievements. In saving hundreds of lives, they had also preserved something equally precious, evidence that even in humanity's darkest hours, the capacity for goodness, courage, and self-sacrifice could not be completely extinguished. The story of how Germans were stunned when an Italian priest smuggled dozens of Jews out in coffins thus represents more than a remarkable episode of wartime resistance. It embodies the enduring human capacity to choose light over darkness, hope over despair, and love over hatred, even when such choices demand the ultimate sacrifice.